Hello and welcome to Comprogis, the home of Celtic languages and culture. My name is Rhys Saunders, and today we're going to be discussing the topic of Celtic nudity in combat. Did it really happen? It seems like a subject that people are generally interested in, and there seems like a lot of caution surrounding it. So we're going to go through the sources and determine whether they're reliable or not, and then come to a conclusion to find out whether this is myth or reality. The evidence that I've collected for this subject I'm going to present to you in event chronology, not in source chronology. Before we take a look at the sources, there are a few points I would like to make. Firstly, I've heard a lot of people say, and even historians say this about the subject, that it's Roman propaganda. Now, to be blunt, it's not. Throughout the sources I've got, there seems to be very little reason to think that. This practice was recorded by Greeks, Romans, and the Celts themselves, and the Greek and Roman statements, most of them appear not to be propaganda. The second issue I have with this subject in general is people claiming, I've heard on numerous occasions, that the sources actually meant they were half naked, not fully naked. I think this is inaccurate. Some sources don't say specifically whether they were naked or half naked, so I don't see how you could say either way. And other sources do specifically say they were naked, or depict they were naked, or just wearing helmets or belts or jewellery. The last point I'd like to make before we begin is that it doesn't really seem that strange to go into battle naked when you consider that only warrior class and aristocrats would have been able to afford any armour. So other than that, you would have just been wearing tunic and trousers, and that doesn't really offer much protection, especially against something like gladi or pila. So let's begin with our earliest event. This source was recorded by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and he writes this in his Histories of Rome, part 14.9, between the years 60 and 7 BCE. It refers to the Senones tribe and their leader Brennus during the sacking of Rome between 387 and 386 BCE. And I quote, "But our foes have their heads bare their breasts and flanks, bare their thighs and legs down to their feet, and they have no other defence except shields. As for weapons of offence, they have spears and very long slashing blades." So is this a reliable source? Well, I'm not too sure if this is a reliable source or not, just for the pure fact that this is a quote taken from Marcus Furius Camillus, and this was during the attack on the Gauls after the sacking of Rome. I'm not sure if this part of the story happened or not. Different sources seem to say different things, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not a valid description of the enemy at the time. So for now, we'll just say that this is not a reliable source. The next source we're going to look at is a frieze from the Civita Alba Etruscan temple, made in the 2nd century BCE. It depicts a Gaulish defeat at the Battle of Delphi in 279 BCE, and it shows Gaulish warriors desperately attempting to flee the scene. It's not in a typical Greek art style, and it seems to be representative of how the artist actually saw the Gauls at the time. He would have been in frequent contact with the Gauls, most probably due to them raiding northern Italy. Some of the Gauls are in full clothing, some of them are just wearing belts. This then, I believe, is a reliable source for Celtic nudity in combat. The third piece of evidence we're going to look at is some famous works of art. It was made by the Romans, but they're copies of original Greek sculptures made of bronze. These are the Dying Gaul, the Ludovici Gaul, and the Kneeling Gaul. They depict Galatian warriors after suffering a defeat at the Battle of Caicus River in 241 BCE. The Kneeling Gaul is completely naked. The Dying Gaul is completely naked aside from a torque, and the Ludovici Gaul is completely naked aside from wearing a cloak. These sculptures were made between 230 and 220 BCE. Are these reliable sources? The answer to that is no, because nudity was common in Greek art at the time. You can see it in all sorts of sculptures which have nothing to do with Gauls or Galatians. You'll see it in sculptures of Greek heroes and Greek gods. This is a 3rd century BCE bronze statue of a naked Celtic warrior. Aside from his horned helmet, his belt and his torque. It was originally from northern Italy, so I would consider this a reliable source, because the sculptor being from northern Italy would have been in frequent contact with the Gauls. The next piece of evidence we're going to look at is called the Braganza brooch. It's a gold fibula made between 250 and 200 BCE. It shows a naked Celtiberian warrior wearing a helmet and a belt, and he has a scabbard. He's carrying a sword and a shield. The brooch was probably made by a Greek craftsman on the Iberian Peninsula. That being said, he must have been surrounded by Celtiberians, so he would have been aware of their customs. But, as we've discussed already, it was quite common for nudity to be in Greek art styles, so I think we can disregard this as evidence for now. For our second written source, we're going to turn to Polybius, who is a Greek author and historian, referring to the Battle of Telamon in 225 BCE. The battle is described in his Histories, part 228, and it was published sometime before 125 BCE, although I couldn't find an exact date. He says, "The insubres and the boy wore their trousers and light cloaks, but the Gaisatae had discarded these garments owing to their proud confidence in themselves, and stood naked, with nothing but their arms in front of the whole army, thinking that thus they would be more efficient, as some of the ground was overgrown with brambles, which would catch their clothes and impede their use of weapons." Part 29. "For there were among them such innumerable horns and trumpets, which were being blown simultaneously in all parts of the army, and their cries were so loud and piercing, that the noise seemed not merely to come from trumpets and human voices, but from the whole countryside at once. Not less terrifying was the appearance and rapid movement of the naked warriors in the van, which indicated men in the prime of their strength and beauty, while all the warriors in the front ranks were richly adorned with gold necklaces and bracelets." Part 30. "When the men who were armed with the pilum advanced in the front of the legions, in accordance with the regular method of Roman warfare, and hurled their pila in rapid and effective volleys, the inner ranks of the Celts found their jerkins and leather breeches of great service, but to the naked men in the front ranks, this unexpected mode of attack caused great distress and discomfiture, for the Gallic shields not being big enough to cover the man, the larger the naked body, the more certainty there was of the pilum hitting, and at last, not being able to retaliate." The account has some interesting details about the naked warriors. What firstly leads me to think this is a reliable source is the statement about removing the clothing due to brambles. This, I believe, is an assumption made by the witness due to what he thinks is the most rational cause of removing the clothing. I'm not totally convinced it was completely to do with the brambles, or if it had anything to do with the brambles at all. I think it's more likely that it was a form of psychological warfare, as it clearly worked, as Polybius remarks on the appearance as being terrifying. I would think if the brambles were that much of an issue, the insubres and the boy would have also removed their cloaks to prevent them getting stuck in the brambles. The other reason I think that this is a reliable source is due to the rest of the information in the statements being accurate. The only concern I have for the statement is the part where he says the leather jerkins and the breeches are of great service, implying they effectively stopped pila. Now, I'm not well versed in pilum combat, but the research I have done shows that pilum could penetrate shields and render them useless. So clearly then, I'm going to assume a thin piece of leather is not going to prevent damage from a pilum. Overall, I believe that this is a reliable source. The next piece of evidence I have is a figure of a Gaulish mercenary in the Ptolemaic army from Egypt between 220 and 180 BCE. He's naked aside from his cloak and belt, and he carries a sword and a shield. His phallus is oversized, probably emphasizing his nakedness. I would consider this a reliable source due to it being made by an Egyptian and representing one of the Ptolemaic ranks. Our next source is another quote from Polybius in his Histories, book 3, 114, describing the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. "The shield of the Iberians and Celts was about the same size, but their swords were quite different, for that of the Roman can thrust with as deadly effect as it can cut, while the Gallic sword can only cut, and that requires some room. And the companies come in alternately, the naked Celts and the Iberians with their short linen tunics, bordered with purple stripes. The whole appearance of the line was strange and terrifying." Can this be used as a reliable source? Well, the statement about the Iberian and Celtic sword seems to refer to the Iberian falcata, which is a single-edged curved blade, compared with the Latin-style leaf-shaped double-edged blade. This makes the source appear credible, and also the mention of the Iberian and Celtic shields being similar in appearance. Overall, Polybius is a reliable source, and I think we can consider this a reliable source also. This next piece of evidence is great because it's actually from the Celts themselves. It's a coin made in the 2nd century BCE in the modern-day Balkans, and is from the Skordiski tribe. The coin depicts a naked female warrior riding a horse, but it could possibly be the horse goddess Epona. This is definitely a reliable source due to it being made by the Celts themselves. This source is of the same nature as the last source, except the coin was made by the Redones tribe from modern-day Rennes, and it was made in the 2nd century BCE. Again, it could be depicting a female warrior on a horse, naked, or it could depict the Celtic horse god Epona. This is also a reliable source. Next, we're going to turn to another written source, and it's from the author and historian Titius Livius. It's referring to the Tolistobogi and the Trocmi tribes at the Battle of Mount Olympus in 189 BCE. This is in his Ab Urbe Condita, 3821, written between 27 and 9 BCE. The fact they fight naked makes their wounds conspicuous, and their bodies are fleshy and white, as is natural, since they are never uncovered except in battle, so that both more blood flowed from their abundant flesh, and the wounds stood out to view more fearfully, and the whiteness of their skins was more stained by the black blood. But they are not much disturbed by open wounds. Indeed, sometimes they cut away the skin when the gash is broad rather than deep, and think that thus they gain greater glory in the fight. Again, due to the reasoning and the detailed nature of the source, I would think that it is reliable. It seems like a very possible form of psychological warfare, although it possibly is exaggerated. To witness a charging enemy, naked and covered in his own blood after further cutting himself, must have been to the Romans astonishing and frightening. Titius Livius overall seems like a reliable source. This is a statuette of a Romanized Gaulish warrior made between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. He is naked aside from his Roman-style sandals. He's holding a shield and a stick with a human head on top of it. It was found in Ilha-Guilen in Brittany and may have been made there, but it could possibly have been imported from elsewhere. It seems to represent aspects of Gaulish and Roman culture, and was found in Gaulish territory, which leads me to think that this is a reliable source, and I would consider it evidence of the practice of nudity in combat after the Roman subjugation of Gaul. This next piece of evidence is a Roman coin from Marcus Aurelius Scaurus in 118 BCE. It depicts an Arverni charioteer from the Arverni War in 121 BCE. Is this a reliable source? It seems to be a reliable source as it's depicting real events of the Arverni defeat. It could be an attempt to put the enemy in a bad light, but that doesn't strictly mean it's inaccurate, it's just inappropriate to Roman standards. Then again, it could be false and be used as a form of propaganda. There's no evidence to support either assumption. Next we have another Roman coin from Lucius Hostilius Sacerna in 48 BCE. It depicts a Gaulish charioteer and warrior during the Gallic Wars. This coin was minted just after the Gallic Wars and would have been very aware of how the Gauls looked and acted. This coin signifies victory over the barbarians, and it could be a form of propaganda. However, that is pure speculation. There is no evidence to support it either way. And even if something is propaganda, that doesn't necessarily mean it's untrue. Next we have another written source by Diodorus Siculus in his Library of History, 529, written between 60 and 30 BCE. He says, "Certain of them despise death to such a degree that they enter the perils of battle without protective armour, and with no more than a girdle about their loins." Part 30. Some of them have iron cuirasses, chain-wrought, but others are satisfied with the armour which nature has given them, and go into battle naked. I would consider this a reliable source, firstly because most of the other things he says in this source about the Gauls seems to be true, with little or no exaggeration. Secondly, he would have been writing this during Caesar's invasion of Gaul, and so he was there at the time. Also, these descriptions seem to be coherent with what other sources tell us. This next source we have is a set of stone slabs from the Antonine Wall in Scotland. They were created by the Second Legion around 142 CE. The Bridger slab. On the left of this slab is a Roman cavalryman trampling a naked Briton. It portrays him being captured and then killed. He's equipped with a shield and a spear. The Balmuldi slab. This slab depicts, on the left, two naked British captives, with arms tied behind their backs, with their shields and daggers scattered around them on the floor. On the right side is a naked captive, with his arms tied behind his back, and his shield lying on the ground. The Hutchison Hill slab. The left and right sides of the slab both have naked Britons kneeling down with their hands bound. I would almost certainly consider this a reliable piece of evidence. Firstly, it would be created by soldiers who would have fought the Britons. Secondly, I've looked into this and it would be very unusual for captives to be stripped naked when taken. The Briton on the Bridger slab is already naked before he's captured, which confirms this. Our next source was written by Herodian between 170 and 240 CE in his History of the Roman Empire from the death of Marcus Aurelius, 314. It refers to events which took place between 208 and 210 CE when Septimus Severus invaded Caledonia. 314.6. Most of the regions of Britain are marshy, since they are flooded continually by tides of the ocean. Note, the barbarians are accustomed to swimming or wading through these waist-deep marsh pools. Since they go about naked, they are unconcerned about muddying their bodies. 314.7. Strangers to clothing, the Britons wear ornaments of iron at their waists and throats. Considering iron a symbol of wealth, they value this metal as other barbarians value gold. They tattoo their bodies with coloured designs and drawings of all kinds of animals. For this reason, they do not wear clothes, which would conceal the decorations on their bodies. 314.8. Extremely savage and warlike, they are armed with only a spear and a narrow shield, plus a sword that hangs suspended by a belt from their otherwise naked bodies. They do not use breastplates or helmets, considering them encumbrances in crossing the marshes. For all these reasons, Severus prepared whatever he thought would be an advantage to the Roman army, and whatever would harass the barbarians and hamper their attacks. This source either has an element of propaganda, exaggeration, or confusion due to the statements such as strangers to clothing. By the sound of it, there seems to be some confusion as to whether it's describing battle or everyday habits. It seems that the other information in this account is accurate, aside from possibly the lack of helmets, although there may well have been no helmets in the battles that Herodian was informed about. The tattoos we're going to go into on another video. Overall, I think this source should be taken with a pinch of salt. I believe it was written with honesty, and quite a bit of the information is accurate, but he was probably confused or misinformed about some of the parts. Next, we'll turn to Gildas in his De Excidio et Conquestu Britannia, chapter 19. He writes this in the 6th century CE, and is referring to the Picts between 389 and 407 CE. He says, in a preference also for covering their villainous faces with hair, rather than their nakedness of body with decent clothing. In the meantime, the barbed weapons of the naked enemies are not idle. By them the wretched citizens are dragged from the walls and dashed to the ground. Gildas is not a reliable source when it comes to non-Christian Britons. He seems prejudiced and he speaks about them with contempt. If this were the only source we had, I'd seriously question it, as it seems he's attempting to put the Pict in a bad light by talking about their nakedness. This then is not a reliable source. Next, we have the Collesi stone from Scotland, made between the 6th and 7th centuries CE. Carved into the stone, it appears to be a naked Pictish warrior. He's armed with a large rectangular shield and a long spear with a leaf-shaped blade. this is certainly a reliable source, as the depiction was carved by the Picts themselves. This is the Easi stone, made in the 8th century in Scotland. The lower left-hand quadrant shows a cloaked but otherwise naked Pictish warrior, armed with a small square buckler and a spear. This is, I would say, a reliable source because it was made by Picts. Whether this depicts nudity in combat in the Christian era, or if it's depicting something from a time before, is uncertain. That is all the sources I have for you. I have got other sources, but I can't be sure if they are Celtic in nature 100% or not, and I'm sure you could find many other sources talking about or depicting nudity in combat from the Celts. I think it seems clear from the abundance of reliable evidence that nudity in combat was carried out throughout Celtic history and all over Europe. It seems to be a shared trait, which implies a possible religious or social aspect to doing this. The only reason I have to doubt the practice is from the lack of evidence from Caesar, who is our main source on the Gaulish walls, and I don't believe he says anything about nudity in combat. And the other one is because Tacitus, which is our main source on the Roman invasion of Britain, I don't think he mentions it at all either. But as we have seen, there is evidence from other things such as coins which were minted around the Gaulish wars and depict the warriors as being naked. The only reason I could think of there being lack of evidence from Caesar and Tacitus is because the practice was probably so widespread and so well known that it's almost pointless mentioning it. It's almost like, if you take a modern example, you're watching the news and they telling you something about the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, then they don't need to describe to you what garments they're wearing. You automatically know what they look like, even though it's completely different to what a Westerner wears. So they probably just assumed that they were naked some of the time in battle. You didn't need to specify that all the time. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe if you did. Diolch yn fawr, gyrf mahagat, and thank you very much for watching and your interest in this wonderful culture.